So we're going to take a look. We're in week 2 of a new series that we're calling Lessons from the Desert. And it's inspired, and I told you last week, it was inspired by this book called The Land Between by a guy named Jeff Mannion. And what he does is we're using the wandering of the Israelites in the wilderness between when they left Egypt and between when they got to the Promised Land as kind of a metaphor, a template for how we deal with those times in our life when we go through the desert. And based on conversations I've had with many of you over the last year, most of you know exactly what the desert looks like. You've either been there or you're in it. And so you know what goes on in the desert. You know what it's like to have unmet expectations or to receive bad news or to have unexpected circumstances or to be worn out or to feel like, man, God just seems so far away, or you're trying to cope with financial problems. I mean, most of us have encountered that at one level or another. And so the main idea of this entire series, we talked about it last week, was simply this, that the desert, that time, those periods in our life where things are not going like we hope, is actually really fertile ground for transformation. So when we're in the desert, we are transformed, and the question becomes, what are we being transformed into? Because it could be really good, or it could be really bad. It could really result in greater faith, greater grace, greater dignity, but it could also be greater bitterness, greater anger, greater resentment. There is a series of films. I don't know if you guys remember these, Final Destination films. I don't know that I've watched these, but I've heard about them. They were put out between 2000 and 2011. There was 5 of them. And the series was called the Final Destination series. And the premise of every movie was basically the same. Someone would get a premonition of something that was going to happen that was going to result in people dying. And because of this premonition, they avoid the incident, they don't die, but then the rest of the movie is how weird things keep happening, and all the people that would have died originally begin to die anyway. And that's why they call it the Final Destination, because the ultimate thing is here is that you can't cheat death. It's the final destination. And the reason I thought of that is the desert kind of sometimes feels that way. Because if you're ever in the desert in your life, it often feels like, oh my goodness, this is going to be me for the rest of my life. I'm stuck here. I can't get out of it. Maybe I made bad decisions. Maybe it was just circumstances. I mean, this is just maybe my life. I'm going to have a miserable relationship. I'm going to have a bad marriage. I'm never going to get out of my financial things. And it's like, oh my goodness, sometimes it looks like it's going to get better. And then you're like, no, but it really doesn't. And the desert feels like it's going to be the final destination. And what I want to talk about this morning is that it is not. The desert is not our final destination. There's a bigger picture, a longer game. And even though most of you probably know that intellectually, when you're in the middle of the desert, it often feels like you're just grabbing on white knuckling. Have you ever done this? How many of you are roller coaster riders? All right, we got a bunch, okay? Now, if you're really cool, and you've done this lots of times, you get on the roller coaster, and what do they do? That's right, okay? Hands up, and you're like, oh, I can do this. You know, especially if you're with your 12-year-old son and you're like, okay, now I have to do this because I've been talking up a good game, right? But the first time you get on a roller coaster, what do? You grab that bar in front of you and you hold on. And when you hit that first, 180-foot drop that goes like this, you don't feel like letting go. You feel like white knuckling it and you squeeze hard. And if you're new to this, you get to the end of the ride and you kind of have to go, right, and pry your hands off the bar. And you're like, well, that was really good. That's what the desert can feel like. You're like, I'm just white-knuckling. I'm just holding on. I'm hoping this ride is going to end, but I'm not sure that it is. Feels like the desert's going to last forever, and it's the final destination. And here's what I want to talk about this morning. When we do that, when we see our desert like that, something can happen. There can be a pattern of behavior that arises in the desert that grows in us, and it's not a good thing. When I quit my first job, I got a job out of college, and I was in it for about 10 years, and I quit that job. And the reason I quit that job, which looking back was not very smart, because I bought into an attitude of complaining. And so what happened was, if you've ever been in a company, you know this, right? You get together, you go to sales meetings, you're with people, and everybody's complaining about the company. They're complaining about your boss. They're complaining about this. I can't believe the company's doing this. They should be treating us better. We're not being paid enough. And it kind of goes on and on and on and on. And I kind of bought into that. And I thought, you know what? They're right. They're not treating us like they should. And so in the end, I left. Found out grass is not always greener on the other side. And all the people that complained and said they were going to leave, do you know what they did? They stayed, absolutely. They were just the complainers that spurred it for me. When we are in the desert, in the land between, one of the easiest things to start to creep into our lives is a pattern of complaining, of grumbling, of whining, of murmuring, of this woe is me attitude. You ever been around a complainer? Seriously, I'm picturing in your head someone who is a complainer. It doesn't matter how the cloud is, they can find the lead lining in a silver cloud every time, right? It's just who they are. They are exhausting to be around. You know this. Because every time you're with them, you're like, at some point, you're like, just stop, right? Because just everything has a problem. And what happens is it multiplies because one complaint leads to the next. And to the next, and to the next. And things you thought were fine, when you walk away, you go, yeah, maybe that's not fine, right? And all of a sudden, you begin to buy into the complaining. When we're in the desert, when we're going through it, this is a huge problem. We're going to talk about why in a second. But I ran across this great quote. It said, whether we age with grace and poise or become bitter, resentful people is largely determined by our responses to disappointments and the habits of response that often results. And for way too many of us, that habit is complaining. Now, you might say, hold on a second. Well, then, aren't we supposed to be honest with our feelings? Aren't we supposed to be willing to share that? I mean, isn't that what we're taught now, is that we have to be honest with our feelings? We have to take that stuff to God. Aren't we supposed to do that? Are you saying that we are supposed to ignore all that? Of course not. But there is a difference between an honest expression of despair or problems and complaining. It's not the same. And actually, next week we're going to look at the art of the lament. But if we're honest, most of the time we're not lamenting, we're simply complaining. So you might say, well, then why are you spending all this time on this? What's the big deal? It's just complaining. I mean, it's just verbal. I mean, let's be honest. Complaining can feel so good. Right? Let me take you through 3 consecutive events that happened. And just to see the whole picture, Israel had now been delivered out of Egypt. So they'd had all this amazing, the 10 plagues, all these miracles. Moses had come back. He led them out of Egypt. So now they've gone from this group of slaves, no government, no anything. They're just basically a mob that comes out of Egypt with their family and with all their stuff. And they come out of Egypt, and of course, the first thing that happens is, Pharaoh changes his mind, pursues them to wipe them out. God opens the Red Sea. They go through the Red Sea. They see the miracles of Jesus. I mean, as the sea is parted, then when Pharaoh comes in, it closes, destroys the army. So they're now free because no one's coming after them. They're on the other side of the sea, and they are free from Egypt. But where are they? In the desert. So let's see what happens. If you're following along, and I'm just going to put bits and pieces up. That's why I encourage you to bring your Bible or look it up on your phone. We're going to be in Exodus 15, 16, and 17. There are 3 events that happen on 3 successive chapters that will help us look at this whole thing this morning. First one starts in Exodus 15. Then Moses led Israel from the Red Sea, and they went into the desert of Shur. And for 3 days, they traveled in the desert without finding water. Now, this is a problem because they needed water. I mean, it's the most basic need in human life. I mean, they needed food too, but here they needed water. It was scarce. Their canteens were starting to run low, and there was a lot of people and a lot of livestock, and all the water they were carrying, and they were starting to get a little worried. And then they see water. They see an oasis in the distance, like, yes, right, this whole group of people, like, great, we were running out of water. This is exactly what we need. We got something finally for our animals, for our kids, for everything else. But when they came to Marah. They could not drink the water because it was bitter. That's why the place is called Marah. And it doesn't mean bitter as in it just tasted bitter. It meant it was undrinkable. It was one of those things that you couldn't drink it because it would make you sick. And the water was no good. It was poisoned. I mean, it's almost like they're coming out, everything's getting worse, and then they see their hope, and their hope goes like this, and then what? Crashes. So what do the people do? All right. There we go. So the people grumbled against Moses. They said, "What are we to drink?" Then Moses cried out to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water. I always wonder what kind of wood that is. He threw it in the water, and the water became fit to drink. It's an amazing miracle. And there the Lord issued a ruling and instructions for them and put them to the test. He said, "If you listen carefully to the Lord your God and do what is right in his eyes, if you pay attention to his commands and keep all his decrees, I will not bring on you any of the diseases that I brought on the Egyptians. For I'm the Lord who heals you." Then they came to Elim, where there were 12 springs, 70 palm trees, and they camped there near the water. So they complained, they got angry, they grumbled, and God provided. And you think, all right, is this a kind of just a one-time thing, or are we starting to see the beginning of a pattern in the lives of the Israelites? They grumble, God provides. Interesting. So we go on to the next chapter. A little more in their journey. The whole Israelite community set up from Elim. So they'd been in Elim, they found this place, they stayed there for a little bit, and then God says, right now it's time to move on. Remember, you're traveling through the desert. And the whole Israelite community, they set out from Elim, and they came to the desert of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai. Right? God's got this destination in mind for them. On the 15th day of the second month, after they had come out of Egypt. I just know which app you touched on, because I've had that exact thing happen to me. It sounds better than me. We should just put it on the mic, reading the... But they come out of Egypt, and in the desert, the whole community grumbles against Moses and Aaron. This is about a month and a half now after being out of Egypt. And you have to put this in context. God had delivered them out of Egypt. He had parted the Red Sea. He had miraculously made the water good to drink. Okay? We're 90 days. That's it. 90 days out from this all stuff happening. And they encounter another problem because they have nothing to eat. There was a lot of them. And the food wasn't very much, and what they had brought from Egypt had run out. There was not much left. And they'd kind of reached this breaking point. And so it says they grumbled against Moses and against Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat. We ate all the food we wanted. You brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death." What is going on? Well, if you're Moses, what do you do? And what follows is the account of how God provided. The Lord said to Moses, "I will rain down bread from heaven for you." And if you remember the story, you can keep reading it. He said, when you get up in the morning, you're going to find this stuff on the ground. It looks like it came like dew. You know, yesterday was very dewy in the morning. You can kind of see it. It was kind of like that, except it's actually not. It's heavenly bread. It's called manna. And when the sun rose, that would all melt away just like the dew does, but whatever you gather is yours to eat. And so they did. It was like little wafers of bread. And so they weren't to save it. They were just to gather as much as they needed for that day, because every morning was going to be the same. And the only exception was Friday, where they were supposed to gather for Saturday as well. And that way you could gather 2 days. They didn't listen to those instructions, by the way, very well. You can read that. But God continued to provide this manna every single day. Pretty amazing, actually. I wonder how fast it became like normal to get up in the morning and tell the kids, "Oh, it's early, you go out and get the manna this morning," right? And you send the kids out and go, "Make sure you get enough, fill the bucket to the top." Like, I wonder how fast that happened. But God does this amazing thing. He provides. Again, they complained, and God provides. Next chapter. The whole Israelite community set out from the desert of Sin. See why they went from the Red Sea to Elim, Elim to Sin. Now they're going from Sin to Sinai. And they camped at Rephidim, but there was no water for the people to drink. Now they're getting food every day, but water is now, again, an issue because you're in the desert. And so they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. You just kind of sense Moses starting to get a little irritated. Moses replies, why do you quarrel with me? Why do you put the Lord to the test? But the people were thirsty for water there, and they grumbled against Moses, and they said, why did you bring us up out of Egypt to make us and our children and our livestock die of thirst? You catching a pattern yet? Right? Then Moses cried out to the Lord, what am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me. And the Lord answered Moses, go out in front of the people. Take with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. I will stand before you by the rock at Horeb. Strike the rock, and the water will come out of it for the people to drink. And so Moses did this in the sight of the elders, the leaders of Israel. And he called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and because they tested the Lord, saying, is the Lord among us or not? Fascinating accounts. But we begin to see a pattern here with the people that they would encounter a problem in the desert and they would complain. Now, you ever thought, well, what's the big deal? So they complained. It's not like they were complaining about a long line at the grocery store, like we do sometimes, or a parking space. I mean, this is water. This is food. I mean, you need these to live. You're going to die without them. It kind of feels like a bit of an appropriate complaint, maybe. You might think it's not that big a deal, but I think what we see here is that God takes complaints way more seriously than we think he might. And the reason isn't because of the complaint, it's because of what it represents, because of what is underneath the complaints. Here's what you notice, a couple different things. Complaints actually encourage distrust. Remember, we talked about this last week. We said that the desert is actually an invitation from God to say, trust me. I know things don't look good. I know life isn't going the way you want. I know that your finances aren't right. I know your relationships aren't where you want them. Trust me in this. Complaints do the exact opposite. I have met many pastors over my time in this role in New Jersey. When I came here, I get to meet with pastors. I see them at all kinds of conferences and stuff. And it's very interesting to listen to a complaining pastor. Because they get together with people and they don't usually get to do this in their own congregations, so they start complaining about their people and they complain how they don't really have enough funds to do the things they want to do, and they complain because they're so frustrated because people keep thwarting everything they try and do. And do you know what you notice with a complaining pastor? It's all about them. Because all of a sudden it's become about all the things and all the obstacles and all the problems. And what happens is they begin to mistrust, and you can see it. They don't trust their people anymore. They don't trust their denomination. They don't trust God in the middle of all this. There's a reason for that. Because complaints actually forget or ignore God's past goodness. Because complaints are focusing on the relief that I need right now. There's no thought for the future. It's all about the present, and it's all about relief in the present. The Israelites, they needed water, and they needed it now. The Israelites needed food. They needed it now. The Israelites needed water again. When did they need it? Now. But because their focus was so much on the relief now, they forgot what had just happened. If you actually read through these three chapters in Exodus, Exodus chapter 15 starts with a song. God had just delivered them from Pharaoh. By opening the sea, they walked through it. I mean, that itself was amazing. Then it comes back, kills the entire army of Pharaoh. They are so excited, they write a song about it that they sing and teach to the entire community. And within days or weeks, they're complaining. Interesting. No recognition, no thinking or remembering what God had just done, because the present was so overwhelming. It was all they could think about. See, when we get in the desert of our lives, it is so easy to forget what God has done or minimize it. Oh, yeah, I know God did something, but that was then. I mean, come on, this is a real problem. Like, yeah, I know God's done stuff, but come on, God, I mean, look what's in front of me now. And it's so easy to forget. And the result is we begin to mistrust because we're not remembering. And if you're like me, you think to yourself, look, if I had seen God part the waters of the Red Sea and rain bread down from heaven, I would not be complaining. I wonder. Because if you went back over your life and said, I saw God here, 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 and here, but I'm in the desert now, God, what are you doing? So, kind of messes with our past goodness, right? But it also gives us a distorted view of what was. So it's not just about forgetting, it gives a distorted view. There's a very interesting progression. I don't know if you noticed this, in the complaints that the Israelites made, okay? They grumbled these 3 different episodes. There's this progression. The first complaint just said, we just need water. I can't believe it, God, we need water. That was all their complaint was. But then if you went to the next one was, if only we had died at the Lord's hand in Egypt, where we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. You brought us out here to starve to death. Do you see how it's changed? Now it's gone from just complaining about, man, I wish I had water. God, what are you doing? To, you know what? We were better off before. They have somehow conveniently forgotten they were slaves, being beaten, killed, forced to labor 7 days a week, every waking hour. But they had onions. I don't know, like, what was going on? And it kind of continues, because then you get into chapter 7, he says, why did you bring us out of Egypt? Yeah, now you're going to kill us and our children and everything. You're going to have us die of thirst. See, what complaints do is they color the past. It seems better than the present. We view it through rose-colored glasses. People who complain will always tell you that the past is better than the present. Every time. Oh, it used to be. We used to do this. Oh, wasn't it nice when this was like this? Oh, you know what? I remember when church was like this. I remember when society was like this. I remember when we didn't have to lock our doors. I remember when our kids could ride their bikes to school. I mean, it just goes on and on and on and on. Because the past was always better than the present. Remember when our kids were young? Oh, it was so good. Now they're older and they're such a mess. See, the problem is a complaining spirit is more about what I want now and what used to be than it is about where God might be taking us. Which leads us to the third part of that. Complaints blame others. Have you ever, be honest, I'm not actually going to have you put your hands up for this. Have you ever thought or said this? I trust God completely, it's people I don't trust. Right? God hasn't let me down, but people have. You ever had that? Yeah, we have. And at first glance, it actually seems like that's what's going on here, because the people are not grumbling about it. Look what it says. So the people grumbled against Moses. Then the next one, in the desert, the whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. And then, so they quarreled with Moses and said, give us water to drink. It's very interesting because it looks like they're grumbling against the leadership. This is the problem. We're here because of you, Moses. You're the issue. If you hadn't done this, we wouldn't be in this place. Then look what Moses does. Moses cries out to the Lord, what am I to do with these people? They're almost ready to stone me. That means they're not just grumbling now. There are people who are talking about chucking rocks at him until he dies. I mean, this is serious. This is not just a couple people murmuring. It's escalated to the place where it's physical violence. When we are in the desert of our lives, when we're between what we used to have or where we were and where we want to be, and we're in this middle place where life is not the way it should be, we start to make our problems the result of other people. If my husband treated me right, if my wife was more attentive, if my boss appreciated me more, if that leader had treated me better and listened to my feedback, if my kids just listened to me. And whether we do this out loud or just in our hearts, there's something going on here that God takes very, very seriously. Because even though it says they grumbled against Moses and they quarreled with Aaron, that's not how God saw it. Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you will know that it was the Lord who brought you out of Egypt. In the morning, you'll see the glory of the Lord. Because he's heard your grumbling against him. Who are we that you should grumble against us? And then later we read again, they called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled because they tested the Lord. There's something going on when we complain, because the ultimate recipient of their complaints is God. When we complain, when we're in the desert, we're saying, God, what are you doing? I can't believe I'm still here. Why have you not fixed this? You seem to be absent. You're not letting things happen because you're causing this and you're allowing that person to do this. And I can't believe that person did that. What we're really saying is, God, I don't trust you. This is your fault. They doubt God's presence. They doubt his goodness. They doubt his purposes. And what we're really saying in our hearts when we complain is things would be better if God wasn't involved. But the desert is not the final destination. But when we think the desert is the final destination, it just becomes really easy to complain because it seems like that's where we're always going to be. What do you do? Well, I'm going to use a term here, and I don't really like it because it's kind of a very Christianese kind of thing that we've heard, but it seems to fit. So bear with me. Because what do? We honestly lean into God. And this idea of leaning in is very popular nowadays. But let me explain what I mean by this. Because honestly leaning to God, even when we don't feel it, is the antidote. It's how we deal with a complaining spirit. What do I mean by that? Look what Moses did. Whoops, let me go back. It says Moses cried out to the Lord. And the Lord said, here's what I want you to do. Then the Lord said to Moses, after the complaint, here's what I'm going to do. And then Moses cries out to God again, what am I supposed to do with these people? The difference between Moses and the rest of the people was that he wasn't complaining, he was asking God for help. He was saying, God, look, because when all the people were complaining, he was messed up, because he was like, I can't believe it. I don't even know if you can picture being in charge of hundreds of thousands of people who are all looking at you and blaming you for everything that goes wrong. Moses doesn't complain to God. It kind of, in some ways, it kind of sounds like that, but he's not really complaining. He's just going to God saying, I don't know what to do. This is a mess. Help me, God. I'm kind of stuck here. I don't know how to deal with these people. Show me how I should act, how I should feel. He was frustrated, and he went to God with this problem. It wasn't so much that he was complaining, right? Blaming God, saying, you're the problem here. I don't trust you. He was saying, in fact, he was saying, God, I trust you. You're the only one I can come to with this. Like, what do I do with all this? God, what's next? How do I proceed? There's a difference between honesty and complaining. Because, again, we're not saying that we don't come to God with all this stuff. When you're in the middle of a desert place, it is awful. It can be a horrible place to be. And you can't just say, well, just smile and don't complain. It doesn't work that way, right? It's miserable. And you're going through your days, stuff predominates your thinking. It can actually cause you to physically feel ill when things are really bad. So it's not that we don't come to God. It's just the spirit of complaining is what the problem is. So honesty says, I'm going to assess this. In other words, I'm going to say, yeah, this isn't the way it should be. Honesty says, I will not minimize the problems right now. They are big. They're overwhelming. I don't get it. I don't understand it. I wish it was better. God, this sucks. But complaints blame others or God for the problem. Honesty comes to God and says, okay, this is the way it is, and I am at a complete loss as to what to do. I don't know how to respond. I don't know what my place is in this, God. What can I do? What are you asking of me? Maybe it's to stop. Maybe it's to do nothing. But God, what is going on? Complaining people say, you need to fix this. They need to fix this. They need to change. God, you need to do something different. Honesty is always humble. It says, I understand that where I am, maybe it's some things I did, maybe it's not, but God, I am going to not obsess about all that because I want to listen to what it is you have to say. Complaints are always self-focused. Me, 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 me. And honesty is hopeful. Honesty says, I'm in the middle of all this. I don't feel like there's anywhere this is going. It feels like the desert's the final destination. I don't know how I'm going to get out of this mess that I'm in. I don't know how I'm going to get this debt paid off. I don't know how I'm going to fix this relationship. But God, I trust you. There is something better that you are doing. Complaints basically throw up your hands and say, you know what? World's going to hell. You know what? I guess it is. Literally, that's what's happening. So you know what? I'm just going to check out. Honesty always comes back to trust. It says to God, I don't get it. I don't like it. I'm not enjoying this. I don't even necessarily understand what you're trying to teach me, but because you've proven it in the past, I will trust you. And complaints say, God, I don't like it. This is a horrible place. I don't understand it. I guess you are untrustworthy. I wonder if God was after something. And we're going to see this as it goes along. I wonder if God was trying to show them something in the middle of this. Think about this. I wonder if he was turning the water from bitter to sweet, which showed them that God can actually bring life from something that was death. When he rained down manna, I wonder if he was trying to encourage the Israelites, you can trust me every single day. When they got water from the rock, maybe he was showing them that you could get something from nothing when God is in charge. What we have not yet learned in this story is whether the Israelites were a people worshiping people who occasionally grumbled, or a grumbling people who occasionally worshiped. We do not get to control what happens to us, but we do get to control our reaction to what happens to us. And we will always choose something when we experience deep disappointment. Always. And the only question is what? And so every choice, every time something happens in the desert, we have this chance to trust, because trusting and complaining are incompatible. They are roommates that cannot live together. And when we choose to trust instead of complaining, it changes everything. Now, most of us do not consider ourselves complainers. If I was to talk to you, most of us would say, well, I'm not a complainer. The complainers then say, I just tell it like it is. Okay, right? But most of us don't feel like we're complainers. But I want you to ask yourself some questions. Do you find yourself being predisposed to seeing bad in the world or in your life? Your first response to things is to see the negative, to see what's wrong. In your conversations with your friends, with the people you know, are you more positive or more negative? You know, think about that hour-long lunch and how much of it was lamenting all the things that are bad as opposed to celebrating what is good. Do you find the problems far easier to think about than the solutions to the problems? Especially when it comes to people. Do you struggle with feelings of bitterness, anger, or resentment? Or let me ask you this, is your faith growing or is it shriveling? Do you find yourself spending more time talking at God than you do listening to God? My frustrations can very easily morph into a spirit of complaint. And that can take up residence in our hearts. And that's why what God is trying to do is saying, Israel, I'm trying to prepare you for something. I want you to trust me, not just because it's some churchy thing or it's some religious thing. It's like, no, we're heading in a direction over here to the promised land, and I need you to begin to lean into who I am, to honestly understand and trust me, because it's going to get worse before it gets better. So you got to learn now for the future. Is there any possibility in our lives that we might be implying, God, I was better off without you? See, honesty is healing. It's freeing. But when we choose to complain, we forfeit the ability to become a people of faith. And with everything that comes up in the desert, God is saying, will you trust me? And with every complaint It's like the Israelites were saying, no, we will not. The desert is not our final destination. We want to, and we're going to continue to talk about this, to move us away from a complaining people or people that are not trusting God to people that are trusting God in the desert. We're all going to have them. You might be in it now. It's not hopeless. It's not the final destination. And God is inviting us to trust him.